Now, I was lucky enough to bump into John Panowski. Hello, John. What's your role here at the museum?
Well, my role today is as a tour guide, but also I'm the vice president of ESAM, and generally I do everything from washing windows, sweeping floors, to giving tours.
And you're going to take me outside, but on the way,
yes,
here we are, and what am I looking at?
Yeah, well, I'd like to show you this before we go outside. This is a very rare, extremely rare aircraft carrier called the Akagi. It was the flagship, Admiral Nagumo's flagship for the attack on Pearl Harbor, December 7th. It was used in the movie. It's a reproduction, of course, very large reproductions, 38 feet long, 2-cylinder diesel engine in it, and you can actually float it from Lake George Village to Fort Ty. It'll float. You'll see in the original movie Tora, 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 which was a pretty accurate description of the attack on Pearl Harbor. It was made $1.2 million for the movie in Japan. There's no plastic, it's all metal, and it was donated by an entrepreneur by the name of Charlie Wood from Lake George. He got it at auction out at, I believe it was United Artists in Hollywood. And he brought it back to Lake George to put it on display and found it was a little too big for his premise and donated it to us. And we're very fortunate to get it.
Boy, what an exhibition. Amazing.
The original aircraft carrier, of course, sits at the bottom of the Pacific Ocean somewhere off the coast of Midway. The Battle of Midway, we lost the Torpedo Squadron 8 doing it, but we got 4 Japanese carriers during that battle, and that was the turnaround for the American forces in the War in the Pacific.
Okay, let's go outside.
We'll go.
So now here we are outside, and John is going to give me a thumbnail on every aircraft. Go ahead, John.
Okay, what you see in front of you here is a UH-1 Huey. It was similar to the types that were flown in Vietnam. They were used them for medevac. They called them dust-offs. This particular one never saw combat, but we have another down the way here. You'll see in a bit. It was a gunship. It was converted to a gunship. This was donated by the Purple Heart Society at Staten Island, New York. We received it from Nassau Community College Aviation Shop. It was donated by the Purple Heart Society.
All right, next. Yes.
Next door to it, we have a Grumman Intruder. It's a A6. They were used in Desert Storm. In fact, they were used in Vietnam towards the end of the Vietnam campaign. It's a very large airplane with a very large radar, and as you can see, it's sort of an ugly looking duck, but it was very purposeful. It could duplicate or double its weight with external stores, bombs and rockets.
Double its weight. Wow.
Yes, double its empty weight.
Okay, and next?
Okay, next door to the Intruder, we have a MiG-17. It's very similar in design and exterior presentation of a MiG-15, which was its granddaddy. The MiG-15 was used in Korea, and of course the 17 was used in Vietnam. The difference being the wing, and also the engine, and it also had an afterburner on it. The length of the fuselage is much longer than a MiG-15. We do have a MiG-15 down the line. The feature of this airplane was it was very maneuverable and could outclimb most of our aircraft, plus the fact it had a 37mm cannon and 2 27mm cannons, and it did a number on our Allied airplanes in Vietnam.
Wow. Like over all of the years of Vietnam, do you have any idea how many of these MiGs were used, flown in combat?
Well,
are we talking thousands or hundreds?
Well, we're talking several hundred, probably no more than 1,000, but they were very strategically located at airfields because of the fact they couldn't fly very long. They didn't have much internal fuel or couldn't fly for any length of time.
And where were they manufactured?
Well, some were manufactured in China under license by the McQueen Gurevich. Some were actually made in Russia.
Okay.
And most of them were made by the Chinese.
Okay. All right, next.
Okay, next door to our MiG is this T-2 Buckeye, manufactured by North American in Ohio. It was a training aircraft, and the tanks that you see on the tips of the wings are fuel tanks, not bombs. But any U.S. Navy pilot that flew jets on aircraft carriers was trained in this aircraft, this type aircraft. It was used primarily for training, sometimes for utility, but generally for combat training and also for carrier landing specifically. We got this one out of Kingsville, Texas.
Okay, next.
Okay, the next aircraft is an F-84F. The original F-84 Bs and Es were flown in Korea, were straight-wing aircraft. And once they entered combat with the MiGs, which were swept-wing, they were outmaneuvered tremendously. So Republic Aircraft down on Long Island took the original airframe, they put a different engine in it, and they also swept the wings, as you can see. And but it was too late for the Korean conflict because the war ended in 1953. The Americans equipped this in 1954. It was used as a tactical fighter. It could carry a heavy load, had a wide landing gear spread. It was easily maneuvered on the ground, but it was somewhat ineffective as a fighter, and of course the F-86s were predominant at the time. The Air Force Thunderbirds originally started out flying this same type aircraft, in fact, that same model, the F model. This particular one was used in a training command in Columbus, Ohio. That's where we got it.
Alrighty, and here.
Okay, next to our F-84 is an F-101 made by McDonnell Douglas. It was they called it the Voodoo. It was a variation of the earlier model of the Phantom, but it was made for one specific purpose, used by the Air Defense Command to shoot down Soviet bombers. And it was the first aircraft to fire off a Genie missile, which was nuclear tipped. It had a rotary, similar to a rotary cannon in a bomb bay that would drop down, and it also had an infrared detector, the chrome dome on the nose just above the radar. It was a heat-seeking device. They could see many miles in front of them as to oncoming aircraft. It was an IR detector, actually. It was a two-place airplane, and they were flown by the Canadians, actually. They had a number of squadrons in Canada. Was flown probably in the early 90s when they were put in the boneyard.
Boy, and here?
Okay, this is a combat vet. This airplane flew out of Ubon, Thailand during the Vietnam conflict. It's an F-4D, it's a D model. It didn't have a gun on it, carried missiles, and also primarily used as a bomber. It was flying four-ship formations, and this one saw a lot of combat. Captain Don Morris was one of the pilots that flew it. He happened to be a member of our museum at one point, but he unfortunately has passed away. He retired as a captain for Southwest Airlines, but this airplane saw a lot of heavy combat.
All right, swinging over here, what do we have?
Okay, next to our F-4, we have an A-10. They called it the Warthog, but actually is a Thunderbolt II, the official designation. But it's not too pretty of an airplane. They called it the Warthog because it was somewhat ugly. But the big feature of this aircraft is on the nose, and that's what you see is a 50 caliber rotary cannon, 6,000 rounds a minute, and actually the cannon goes all the way back to that red striped fairing. It weighs over 7,000 pounds. Literally, the aircraft was made around the gun, and the pilot sits in a titanium tub. This was used very effectively during the second Iraqi war. It was primarily manufactured as a tank killer, and it did that very, very well. If you saw some of the news clips, you saw the Iraqi tanks. Generally, these A-10s, and they were slow and low, but they were very, very effective. They're still flying them. The Air Force still has them in inventory. This is an early version, but the later ones are been modified extensively.
Wow. Okay, swinging over.
Swinging over, we have a MiG-21. That was the crowning glory of the MiG company at the time during Vietnam. That flew twice the speed of sound. It was a Mach 2 airplane. A very, very fast airplane. It had a triangular shaped wing on it. And as you can see, a very severely swept back wing. Single seat. It didn't have a gun. It carried ATOL missiles, which were copies of our AIM-9 missiles. Almost identical to our weapon. The little hogback you see on the top behind the canopy is a fuel tank, and that was one of the things. This thing burnt fuel so bad. It only had about a 45-minute to an hour endurance before it had to get on the ground and get some more gas. Either that or carry external fuel tanks. But it was a very, very fast and effective airplane, and that one there was made in the Soviet Union.
Wow. All right, and this beautiful aircraft.
Which one?
With the Flying Tiger mouth.
Oh, okay. That airplane is also a combatant of the Vietnam conflict. That's an F-105G called the Wild Weasel. It has quite a combat history in it. They call them a Wild Weasel because they never flew in a straight path. And if you see the blisters on the side of the fuselage that were downward-looking radar, they would be the first into the combat zone, and when the radar from the SAM missile sites would come online, they would detect it in the cockpit there and fire off a harm missile, which would fly the beam right back, that radar beam, right to its source and explode, and obviously make a clean path for the bombers that would come behind it. That airplane, actually on the third mission to drop the Paul Doomer Bridge in Hanoi, was lead the force aircraft. Has quite a combat history also. If you ever read the book called the Ravens about the CIA operations in Laos, you'll read where an airplane went down. That particular airplane went in there and saved the day for the downed airmen. On page 153 of that book, you'll read about that.
Wow.
It has a presidential unit citation patch for his efforts.
And
Flew out of Tak Lee, out of Thailand.
And swinging here left is a small
Swinging
craft?
to the left is an aircraft. That's a MiG-15. That's the barrel-shaped fuselage, very small, very maneuverable, very fast. And during the Korean conflict, they actually shot down a number of our B-29 bombers going over to bomb Pyongyang. That one there particularly is painted in the camouflage paint of the North Koreans, and that's the national insignia on the fuselage. The airplane was actually manufactured in China, and also some of the Chinese pilots flew them during the Korean conflict, as well as the Russians, who never admitted to it until after 1990. But at any rate, it's the granddaddy to the MiG-17. Boy.
Now, what have we got here?
Okay, this is one called Proud Mary. That was its call sign was Type Band 3-1. This was a gunship. It's a UH-1 Huey. Again, it's a different version, a single-engine version. This was used as a combatant in Vietnam. I forget the base, the Army base that it was at. But the crew chief of this airplane actually comes from Saratoga, New York. He come here one day and was surprised to see the tail number, and we have a picture of him during the Vietnam conflict standing next to him. This particular one we got from the Picatinny Arsenal in Pennsylvania, and it was a donation from them. I don't know the combat history, but it did have quite an extensive combat history as a gunship.
And over here.
Okay, next to it is one of our crowning glory aircraft. It's a F-14 made by Grumman in Long Island. Flew off the aircraft carrier Kennedy during the Desert Storm. It was flown in here, and it was not this particular airplane, but if you pan over to the black airplane, that's an F-5 that was used in the movie Top Gun. It depicted the combat training that the Navy did out of Miramar, and it actually was filmed in southern Nevada, called a Navy base called Fallon, and that airplane was actually in the movie Top Gun. It was all black, and it was a dissimilar training aircraft, training our pilots against Soviet-type aircraft. The F-5, made by Northrop Grumman, the performance is very similar to a MiG-21.
And this aircraft?
Okay, this is what they call Heineman's Hot Rod. It's designed by a fellow by the name of Heineman for Douglas Aircraft. It's a Douglas A4 Skyhawk. The Blue Angels flew these for about 10 or 12 years in their formation flying. One identical to this is an A4F model, which this is. This has been modified to a degree because this was flown as an adversarial airplane out of Navy Oceana down in Virginia Beach. And if you notice on the tail, it's got a radar device, and that was what they used to signal that they were shot down. In other words, they would duel it in combat dicing, if you would call it that. And the F-14s out of Oceana would come out. Of course, this was all done over water. and electronically they would shoot these down, and once he got shot down, he'd turn around and go back. They called knock it off on the radio, and he would go back to his base. But the airplane itself was identical to those flown by the Blue Angels.
And you mentioned John McCain?
John McCain flew one like this. He flew a C model off the carrier Hancock, I'm sorry, he flew it off the Saratoga. And he got shot down over Hanoi and spent 7 years in Hanoi Hilton, as they called it, prison camp in Hanoi. That's a consolidated F-102. That was also a Mach 2 fighter. It was built in 1958, but considering the technology of the time, it was very, very advanced. Its wing is, again, similar to the MiG-21. It's a diamond-shaped, triangular-shaped wing. There is no elevator, if you would. They call them elevons on a tail. There is no distinct tail other than a vertical tail. A very, very fast airplane for its time frame.
How fast?
Air Defense
How
Command.
fast?
It approached Mach 2. It's probably around just under 1.45 Mach, which is Mach is the speed of sound at sea level. On a normal day is 765 miles per hour. So they can Mach 1.5 would be roughly around 1,200 miles per hour, give or take.
What do we have here?
Okay, there's a couple of airplanes that are unique to our collection. What you see directly in front of you, the black airplane with the WF on the tail, was actually flown here by GE Flight Test way back in the 50s, and they were testing autopilots, radar components, fire control, weapons control systems. Eventually it left here, went over to Raytheon over in Massachusetts and flew testing for those folks, and wound up on the carrier Intrepid down in New York City. They in turn repainted it with Marine colors. These are the colors of a Marine squadron that flew in Korea, that saved the day for the U.S. Air Force because it was a night fighter. And of course, as I mentioned earlier, the MiGs were shooting down B-29s during the daytime operations, so the Air Force went to nighttime operations but didn't have a night fighter support. And the Navy stood forward and said, hey, we got a good airplane here for that purpose. Carried 4 20mm cannons in the nose, and one of its type was the very first air-to-air combat, jet-to-jet combat with a shoot-down of the enemy. And they shot down several, in fact, MiG-15s, and also a Yak-3.
And on to the left?
Okay, to the left of that is another unique airplane, one of which there are only 3 in the world. This is the only one in North America. The other 2 are in the UK. We had to get permission from the Defense Ministry of the UK to get this airplane here at Schenectady, and that also came from the Intrepid. It's a last of the Supermarine built aircraft, and Supermarine being the famous air company that built the Spitfire during the Battle of Britain.
Let's go around front, take a front view.
Okay,
here we go, real close up.
Okay, this is again the Supermarine Scimitar. They called it the F1, built for the Royal Navy. And as you can see, it's a very large aircraft with 2 powerful Rolls-Royce Olympus engines in it, I believe. At any rate, the airplane was a high performer for the size of the aircraft carriers. Consequently, they had a number of operational accidents. In fact, if you go on YouTube, you can see one coming in for a landing, and it actually traps the cable, but the cable snaps, and he went off the side of the carrier, and unfortunately, the pilot went down with the airplane. But they made 78 of them, and they lost 36 due to operational training accidents, if you want to call them that. And of course,
tell me again, you say they were just too big and too fast for the British aircraft carrier.
The aircraft was a very high-performing airplane. In fact, the pilots that flew them successfully loved them. The operational errors, again, as I say, where the carriers were too small, and they didn't have a launch system similar to the U.S. with the steam catapults. And they had a number of accidents due to carrier-type operations. So they were relegated to land bases. Singapore, Aden had them, and eventually they were the Sea Vixen aircraft was the one that replaced this. But they used this for land operations.
Okay, swinging over here to the left.
Okay, to the left we have another combatant in Desert Storm. That's a Link Temco Corsair 2. LTV is the name of the company, built in Dallas, Texas. But this particular airplane was a bomber. As you can see, the racks on it, it carried each rack carried 3 bombs on it. Actually, they call it a terror rack. And it also had side-mounted Sparrow missiles that fit just behind the national insignia there on the fuselage, 2 of them for defensive, and also had a cannon. But that particular airplane had over 120 missions off the carrier Kennedy during the Desert Storm conflict, and also it successfully sunk an Iraqi gunboat. It's quite a combat history on it.
Okay, John, we have 2 planes to go. Here's one. Tell me about this aircraft.
Okay, this is an RA-5C Vigilante. It was designed as a nuclear bomber. It actually carried 3 bombs immersed in fuel tanks in the belly of the fuselage. And the mission profile was they would fly to a target, consume the fuel that was in those tanks, zoom up to 13,000 feet, and eject the 3 bombs, nuclear bombs, out of the tail on a rail system. Empty tanks, of course, as well. And then they would go back to the carrier. But along come Vietnam, and a guy by the name of McNamara said, "Hey boys, you Navy guys have got your submarine-launched nuclear missiles. Let the Air Force handle the air delivery." So now they got stuck with a very, very fast airplane. Mach 2.2, held an altitude record of 90,000 feet. It was a precursor to the SR-71 for the Navy, and they decided to make it a photo recon aircraft. So they put what they call a canoe under the belly of it, held 21 cameras. In fact, they had a TV camera up front. Day, night, it would take pictures, any conditions, weather or whatever. And they would fly. The mission profile was, as a recon, they'd fly over a target zone, take the photographs, go back to the carrier. The intel would interpret them, and then they would send the bombers in and hit the bridge or a rail yard or whatever, and then these guys would come back and take post-strike photos. And the enemy was just sitting there waiting for them. They knew they were coming back, and 18 of them got shot down in an aircraft fire.
Okay, here's our last aircraft.
Okay,
it looks like they're working on it.
Yes, they are. They're doing a little TLC on this airplane. This is one of the ones we got off the carrier Intrepid again, as a result of them getting the Space Shuttle Enterprise. At any rate, it's a Cold War airplane. It was a torpedo bomber, dropped depth charges, and it would fly with another aircraft. They call them a tracer and a tracker. One would find the submarine, and these guys would be the killer. And they dropped, has a bomb bay in it. At any rate, it's like I say, it's a Cold War era aircraft, piston engine. The Navy flew many of these. In fact, the Japanese, a lot of the NATO countries still flying them on Lend-Lease. As you can see, it came off the carrier Intrepid. It's made by, again, a Grumman airplane, and we showcase the history of aviation in New York, including the manufacturers, and Grumman being a big one down there in Long Island. But this airplane is quite simple to fly. A lot of them are being flown in air show circuits, giving rides as well. Easy airplane for the Navy to handle on a carrier deck.
Wow. Okay, let's see. Stay right there. A couple questions. What aircraft in the next few years do you kind of hope to acquire?
Well, we got our eye on several of them. I've been talking to the Danish Air Force about getting an F-104 Starfire. They have a couple in Denmark that are in storage, and that's one aircraft that we'd love to have. It's part of the Century Series aircraft that we already got collected, the 101, 102, the 105. We need the 104 to fill in the numbers. The other one is there's an airplane that I understand down in Arizona, Marana, Arizona, belongs to a civilian, a fellow from New Mexico, but it supposedly was one of the airplanes flown by Eisenhower as the presidential Air Force One. There were 3 aircraft designated Air Force One. This is Air Force number 2. The original Air Force number 1 for Eisenhower is at the Air Force Museum. But that's another aircraft we're sort of looking forward to getting. And then, of course, an F-16, similar to the ones flown by the 174th in Syracuse in Desert Storm. In fact, the one we're looking for is a very unique airplane for our purposes. It was one of our members, retired wing commander in the Air Force, flew was actually checked out in a particular airplane, tail number 008, sits in a boneyard, and his son 20 years later was checked out in the very same airplane, and we'd love to get that airplane. I understand though from the Air Force Museum it doesn't belong to the Air Force Museum, it belongs to the Systems Command, and they're going to take the earlier block of F-16s and use them as remote targets or pilotless aircraft and take them down over the Gulf and have the newer aircraft shoot them down. But we'd like to save that particular aircraft.
My goodness.
There's 3 airplanes we're looking to get.
Wow. Let's see. Tell me this. What are the top-of-the-line fighter jets now? Well,
the Air Force top-of-the-line fighter jet is the F-22. Of course, the Navy has the FA-18, which has been modified a number of times. It's a very, very high-performing aircraft. But the F-22, they've had some problems with the oxygen system, but there are several squadrons that are flying in Alaska and in Langley, Virginia. They got one in Hawaii. That's the top-of-the-line aircraft. It's a stealth-type airplane. It's what they call super cruise. But now the tendency now is for unmanned flight vehicles. They're making a number of those. You probably see on the news that they're unmanned and they're controlled from some remote base in the United States, and they're being flown in Afghanistan and whatnot.
The drones. Would you like to get one of those?
Well, if we can, but they're somewhat new to the inventory of both the military, the Navy and the Air Force. So maybe in the near future we might be able to get one from Syracuse.
I am so impressed by this collection that we have at ESAM. How many aircraft museums in the USA compare with this museum?
Well, our museum, of course, we're non-government associated. We're privately funded. We depend on membership and also grant money. And of course, money's pretty tight as we speak. So we're sort of struggling along to maintain these aircraft. And of course, we'd love to have some of the more, historically valuable aircraft indoors. And that's another issue. We'd like to build a brand new hangar facility if possible. But our collection here is somewhat unique. We've got some very rare airplanes, as I mentioned. The 3, the Vigilante, the Scimitar, the F-3D Skynight, the black airplane out there that we saw, are very rare. There's very few of them remaining in inventory. Of course, the MiG aircraft, there are a number of aircraft around the world, but they're somewhat unique to a private collection. We've got a MiG-15, 17, and a MiG-21. We get them as they become available, so it's pretty difficult to try to get these aircraft, these very rare airplanes. Of course, the fabric-covered airplanes are indoors. Those that we have to be protected from the weather. The weather can take its toll, so there's a continuing maintenance requirement to keep these airplanes dressed up, so to speak. And those that are military aircraft are on loan from either the Air Force Museum or the Navy Museum, and they require that we keep them presentable for the public display. So it does drain our budget, if you would. We have to pay for it. We don't get any money from the military to maintain it.
Any closing remarks you'd like to make for this phenomenal tour you've given me?
Well, I'd like to thank you all for coming, and I hope to project to the local community that we are open normally in the summertime from Tuesday through Sunday. We're closed on a Monday, and of course as the weather permits in the wintertime, we have restricted hours. We're only open Friday, Saturday, and Sunday. But we do have indoor displays. We love to have the kids, and the kids love to sit in our airplanes. We do have open cockpit in the summertime. Every weekend we open up an airplane and the kids can come and see it, as well as the adults. So we appreciate the local help. We appreciate donations of any kind, corporate or otherwise. And we thank you all for coming today.
Okay, Empire State Aerosciences Museum. Talking with John Panowski, a trustee, and we're just a little bit north of Schenectady on Route 50. Thanks, John.
Okay, thank you.
Wow. Like over all of the years of Vietnam, do you have any idea how many of these MiGs were used, flown in combat?
Well,
Are we talking thousands or hundreds?
well, we're talking several hundred, probably no more than 1,000. But they were very strategically located at airfields because of the fact they couldn't fly very long. They didn't have much internal fuel, or couldn't fly for any length of time.
And where were they? Where were they manufactured?
Well, some were manufactured in China under license by the Mikoyan and Gurevich. Some were actually made in Russia.
Okay.
And most of them were made by the Chinese. Okay.
All right, next.
Okay, next door to our MiG is this T-2 Buckeye, manufactured by North American in Ohio. It was a training aircraft, and the tanks that you see on the tips of the wings are fuel tanks, not bombs. But any U.S. Navy pilot that flew jets on aircraft carriers was trained in this aircraft, this type.
Now, I was lucky enough to bump into John Panowski. Hello, John. What's your role here at the museum?
Well, my role today is as a tour guide, but also I'm the vice president of ESAM, and generally I do everything from washing windows, sweeping floors, to giving tours.
And you're going to take me outside, but on the way,
yes,
here we are, and what am I looking at?
Yeah, well, I'd like to show you this before we go outside. This is a very rare, extremely rare aircraft carrier called the Akagi. It was the flagship, Admiral Nagumo's flagship for the attack on Pearl Harbor, December 7th. It was used in the movie. It's a turnaround for the American forces in the War in the Pacific.
Okay, let's go outside.
We'll go.
So now here we are outside, and John is going to give me a thumbnail on every aircraft. Go ahead, John.
Okay, what you see in front of you here is a UH-1 Huey. It was similar to the types that were flown in Vietnam. They were used them for medevac. They called them dust-offs. This particular one never saw combat, but we have another down the way here. You'll see in a bit. It was production. It was converted to production. This was donated by the Purple Heart Society at Staten Island, New York. We received it from Nassau Community College Aviation Shop. It was donated by the Purple Heart Society.
All right, next. Yes.
Next door to it, we have a Grumman Intruder. It's a A6. They were used in Desert Storm. In fact, they were used in Vietnam towards the end of the Vietnam campaign. It's a very large airplane with a very large radar, and as you can see, it's sort of an ugly looking duck, but it was very purposeful. It could duplicate or double its weight with external stores, bombs and rockets.
Double its weight. Wow.
Yes, double its empty weight.
Okay, and next?
Okay, next door to the Intruder we have a MiG-17. It's very similar in design and exterior presentation of a MiG-15, which was its granddaddy. The MiG-15 was used in Korea, and of course the 17 was used in Vietnam. The difference being the wing, and also the engine, and it also had an afterburner on it. The length of the fuselage is much longer than a MiG-15. We do have a MiG-15 down the line. The feature of this airplane was it was very maneuverable and could outclimb most of our aircraft, plus the fact it had a 37mm cannon and two 27mm cannons, and it did a number on our Allied airplanes in Vietnam. The reproduction, of course, very large reproductions, 38 feet long, two-cylinder diesel engine in it, and you can actually float it from Lake George Village to Fort Ty. It'll float. You'll see in the original movie Tora, 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 which was a pretty accurate description of the attack on Pearl Harbor. It was made $1.2 million for the movie in Japan. There's no plastic, it's all metal, and it was donated by an entrepreneur by the name of Charlie Wood from Lake George. He got it at auction out at, I believe it was United Artists in Hollywood, and he brought it back to Lake George to put it on display and found it was a little too big for his premise and donated it to us, and we're very fortunate to get it.
boy, what an exhibition. Amazing.
The original aircraft carrier, of course, sits at the bottom of the Pacific Ocean somewhere off the coast of Midway. The Battle of Midway, we lost the Torpedo Squadron 8 doing it, but we got 4 Japanese carriers during that battle, and that was the